There was a time when becoming an adult in America followed a path that felt almost universal. You finished school, you found a steady job, you got married or planned to, and at some point, often sooner than you expected, you bought a small house. Not a dream house, not a perfect house, just a house. It was usually modest. 1 bathroom, 2, maybe 3 bedrooms, a narrow driveway, a small backyard, sometimes no garage at all. These homes didn't stand out. In fact, they blended in so well that entire neighborhoods looked almost identical. And that was the point. For millions of Americans after World War II, these houses weren't symbols of luxury. They were symbols of arrival. Proof that life was beginning. Proof that the future felt stable enough to plan for. Many people watching this lived in one of these homes. Others knew someone who did. Some raised families in them. Some still drive past the streets where they once stood. At the time, no one called them starter homes. They were just homes. They worked because everything around them worked too. Wages, prices, expectations, all moved at roughly the same pace. You didn't need to be wealthy. You didn't need help from parents. You didn't need perfect timing. You needed consistency, patience, and a job that paid the bills. And for decades, that was enough. What makes this story unsettling isn't that these houses were small, plain, or simple. It's that they were built deliberately, by design, to solve a real problem. Millions of young families needed a place to live. The country needed stability. Communities needed roots. So America built them. Street after street, city after city, state after state. And for a long time it worked. Which raises a quiet question. If this system functioned so well for so many people, why does it feel impossible today? The homes themselves didn't suddenly collapse. They didn't vanish overnight. Many are still standing. Some have been expanded, others renovated, some replaced entirely. But the idea behind them, the idea that an ordinary working adult could reasonably buy a first home, slowly disappeared. Not through a single decision, not through a single crisis, but through a series of changes that at the time didn't seem dramatic at all. This is not a story about nostalgia, and it's not about blame. It's about understanding how something once considered normal quietly became unreachable, and why a system built to welcome people into adulthood now feels closed to them instead. Why starter homes were built after World War II. When World War II ended, the United States faced a situation it had never experienced before. Millions of young men were coming home at the same time. They were leaving military camps, ships, and foreign cities behind, and returning to a country that needed to absorb them back into everyday life. Quickly. These men wanted what people have always wanted after years of uncertainty, stability, a steady job, a family, a place that felt permanent. But America wasn't ready. During the war, very little housing had been built. Construction materials were tightly controlled. Labor was redirected toward factories, shipyards, and military infrastructure. By 1945, the country was already facing a housing shortage, and the pressure was about to multiply. Suddenly, millions of returning veterans were looking for places to live at the same time. The traditional housing market could not handle it. Large, custom-built homes took too long to construct and cost too much. Older urban housing was overcrowded or deteriorating. Boarding houses and temporary rentals were never meant to support long-term family life. Something new was needed. Not luxury, not size, not prestige. What America needed was speed, affordability, and scale. And that is exactly what it built. The idea behind starter homes was not romantic. It was practical. These houses were designed to be built quickly, using standardized plans, inexpensive materials, and efficient layouts. Many were assembled using techniques borrowed directly from wartime manufacturing: repetition, modular parts, and streamlined processes. Entire neighborhoods were planned at once, not one house at a time. Roads, sidewalks, utility lines, lots. Everything was mapped before construction even began. The goal was simple: create places where ordinary working families could settle down immediately, without waiting years or saving for decades. These homes were intentionally modest. They were small because smaller homes cost less to build and less to maintain. They had simple designs because complexity slowed construction. They often shared near-identical layouts because repetition made housing affordable at scale. To modernize, they might look plain, even boring. At the time, they were revolutionary. For the first time, homeownership was no longer reserved for the wealthy or the urban elite. It became a realistic option for factory workers, clerks, technicians, and returning soldiers starting families. The location of these homes mattered too. They were usually built on the edges of cities, places that had once been farmland or open space. Land was cheaper there, and expansion was easier. These areas became the early suburbs, connected to cities by roads that were improving rapidly during the same period. Living slightly outside the city was no longer a disadvantage. Cars were becoming common. Commutes were manageable. Space was abundant. This shift changed the geography of American life. Instead of growing upward, cities began growing outward. Instead of dense urban blocks, families moved into low-rise neighborhoods. Instead of renting indefinitely, people bought. Starter homes were never meant to be final destinations. They were stepping stones. The assumption was that as families grew, incomes would rise. People might eventually move into larger houses or renovate their original homes over time. But the first step, the entry point into ownership, mattered more than anything else. It anchored people. Owning a small home created predictability. Mortgage payments were stable. Neighborhoods felt permanent. Children stayed in the same schools. Communities developed shared rhythms. More importantly, the system assumed balance. Wages, housing costs, and living expenses moved together. If income increased slowly, so did prices. There was friction, but it was manageable. You didn't need to time the market. You didn't need outside help. You didn't need perfect conditions. You needed a job and patience. That assumption shaped everything. These homes were not built as investments. They were built as places to live. Appreciation was not the primary goal. Stability was. This mindset influenced how people treated their homes. They maintained them, expanded them carefully, passed them on. The house was part of life, not a financial strategy. For decades, this model worked. Young adults entered the workforce. They bought modest homes. They raised families. They slowly moved forward. The system didn't promise wealth. It promised continuity. And that promise was strong enough to shape an entire generation's expectations about adulthood. What makes this period important is not just that homes were affordable. It's that affordability was assumed. It was built into the structure of the economy, the design of neighborhoods, and the planning decisions made at every level. No one thought of this as a golden age. It was simply normal. That normality is what makes the story difficult to understand today. Because the houses themselves did not change overnight, but the conditions that made them possible eventually did. And when those conditions shifted, the idea of the starter home quietly began to disappear, long before most people realized anything was wrong. How starter homes actually worked for ordinary families. What made starter homes powerful wasn't their design. It was how well they fit into everyday life. These houses worked because they were part of a system that made sense from beginning to end. Not just economically, but socially and psychologically as well. For most families, buying a starter home did not feel like a gamble. It felt like a natural step forward. The price of the house was aligned with a single income. In many cases, one steady salary was enough to cover the mortgage, utilities, food, and basic living expenses. The margin wasn't luxurious, but it was predictable. That predictability mattered. Mortgage payments were usually fixed. Property taxes were modest. Maintenance costs were manageable because the houses were small and simple. There were fewer surprises, fewer emergencies that could derail a family financially. People knew what the next month would look like. This stability allowed families to plan their lives around something solid. They could save slowly. They could raise children without constant fear of displacement. They could make decisions years ahead, not just weeks. Starter homes were also built with daily routines in mind. Kitchens were practical, not decorative. Living rooms were sized for family gatherings, not entertaining large crowds. Bedrooms were modest but functional. Every square foot had a purpose. These homes did not encourage excess. They encouraged use. Children played in small backyards. Parents worked on minor repairs over weekends. Neighbors saw each other regularly, not by accident, but because the layout of these neighborhoods made isolation difficult. Sidewalks were close to the street. Front porches faced outward. Houses sat near one another, not hidden behind walls or long driveways. People walked, talked, and watched over each other's homes. Community was not a marketing term. It was a byproduct of proximity. Schools, grocery stores, and local services were usually nearby. Not always within walking distance, but close enough to feel connected. Daily life did not require constant long commutes or complex logistics. Time was less fragmented. That mattered just as much as money. Another overlooked factor was expectation. People who bought starter homes did not expect immediate comfort or perfection. They expected gradual improvement. The house was something you grew into, not something that arrived finished. A second bathroom might come later, a larger kitchen someday, an extra bedroom if finances allowed. The house could change as life changed. This mindset reduced pressure. There was no need to compare constantly, no sense of falling behind if someone else upgraded faster. The baseline was shared. Starter homes created a common starting line. That shared starting line made social mobility feel attainable. People weren't trying to leap forward. They were moving step by step, alongside others doing the same. This is something that's hard to measure but easy to feel. Owning a small home gave people psychological footing. It changed how they saw themselves. Renters worried about leases, landlords, and rising costs. Owners worried about maintenance, but they also felt rooted. That sense of root changed behavior. People invested time into their homes because they expected to stay. They invested in their neighborhoods because those places felt permanent. They joined local organizations, volunteered, and built long-term relationships. Starter homes didn't just house families. They stabilized them. There was also an important generational effect. Children raised in these homes grew up watching adulthood unfold in a predictable way. They saw their parents buy a house, maintain it, and slowly improve their circumstances. This shaped expectations about what adulthood looked like. Work led to stability. Stability led to progress. That pattern repeated itself across millions of households. It wasn't perfect. There were exclusions. There were inequalities. There were groups left out of this system entirely. But for those inside it, the structure was consistent enough to feel dependable. And that dependability mattered more than comfort. Starter homes acted as buffers. When life changed, a job shift, a new child, a temporary setback, families had something steady beneath them. The house absorbed uncertainty instead of amplifying it. That buffering effect is easy to overlook today, but it was central to why this model worked. People didn't need to maximize returns. They didn't need to time markets. They didn't need to treat housing as strategy. The house was a background element, not the main problem to solve. Life happened on top of it. For decades, this arrangement shaped how Americans understood adulthood. Buying a first home was not a finish line, it was an entry point, a way into responsibility, stability, and independence. And because it was reachable, it didn't feel exceptional. It felt normal. That normality is what made the system so powerful, and what made its disappearance so disorienting later on. Because when something that once quietly supported everyday life begins to fail, people don't notice right away. They adapt, they stretch, they compensate. And by the time the strain becomes obvious, the foundation that once made everything feel manageable is already gone. That is where this story begins to turn. When the system quietly changed. What makes the disappearance of the starter home difficult to trace is that nothing dramatic happened all at once. There was no single law, no single collapse, no moment when people woke up and realized the system no longer worked. Instead, the change came slowly, through decisions that on their own seemed reasonable, even sensible. And because these changes were gradual, most families adapted without realizing what they were losing. One of the earliest shifts came from land use. As suburban neighborhoods expanded, local governments began tightening zoning rules. Minimum lot sizes increased. Single-family zoning became more restrictive. Density was limited, often intentionally. These policies were usually framed as protections, preserving neighborhood character, reducing congestion, maintaining property values. At the time, few people objected, but the effect was subtle and powerful. By limiting how many homes could be built on a given piece of land, housing quietly became scarcer. Scarcity raised prices, not immediately, but steadily, and smaller, simpler homes became harder to justify financially. Developers followed the incentives. If land was expensive and regulations were strict, building a modest starter home made less sense. Larger homes offered higher margins. More square footage meant higher sale prices, even if construction costs rose. So the average house grew. What had once been a small, efficient entry point became a larger, more expensive product. The starter home began to disappear not because people rejected it, but because fewer were being built. At the same time, the financial environment was changing. Credit became more complex. Mortgage products multiplied. Lending standards shifted over the decades, tightening in some periods and loosening in others. Interest rates fluctuated. Fees increased. Home ownership became more financialized. Instead of being primarily a place to live, housing gradually became a vehicle for wealth preservation and growth. Appreciation started to matter more. Timing the market became a topic of conversation. This changed behavior. Buyers began stretching further, borrowing more, and viewing homes less as long-term anchors and more as strategic purchases. The line between shelter and investment blurred. For families already inside the system, rising values felt reassuring. Their homes were worth more. Their equity grew. The change didn't feel threatening. For those trying to enter, the door began to narrow. Another shift came from infrastructure and transportation. As suburbs expanded further from city centers, commutes grew longer. Dependence on cars increased. Costs accumulated quietly. Fuel, maintenance, time. Living farther out was once a trade-off that made housing cheaper. Over time, that trade-off became less favorable. Savings on housing were offset by higher transportation and living costs. The simple math that once made starter homes viable began to weaken. Wages played a role too. For decades after the war, wages rose in a way that roughly matched productivity and living costs. That balance slowly eroded. Income growth became uneven. Some sectors advanced quickly, others stagnated. Housing costs, meanwhile, continued to climb. This created a widening gap between what people earned and what homes cost, especially at the entry level. The first rung on the ladder grew farther away from the ground. Cultural expectations shifted alongside these economic changes. Homes were no longer marketed as modest beginnings. They were presented as reflections of identity, success, and lifestyle. Size, upgrades, and aesthetics became selling points. The idea of starting small lost status. This mattered more than it might seem. When smaller homes lost cultural appeal, political and economic support for building them weakened as well. Communities resisted denser developments. Residents opposed smaller lots. The starter home became easier to dismiss. All of this happened quietly. People still bought homes. Neighborhoods still expanded. Life continued. But the underlying logic had changed. What had once been a system designed to absorb young adults into stability became a system that favored those already inside it. Each adjustment made sense locally. Together, they reshaped the entire landscape. The starter home didn't disappear overnight. It faded. It faded from planning discussions, from development incentives, from cultural imagination. And because older generations already owned homes, the shift didn't immediately register as a crisis. For many, it felt like a natural evolution. Prices rose, but so did values. Equity grew. The system appeared healthy. It wasn't until a new generation tried to follow the same path that the problem became obvious. They worked, they saved, they waited. And still, the entry point was gone. What had once been an ordinary step into adulthood now required exceptional circumstances, higher incomes, family assistance, perfect timing, or significant risk. The system had not collapsed. It had simply reoriented itself, and in doing so, it quietly closed the door that starter homes were originally built to open. Why starter homes no longer exist as an entry point. By the time many people realized something had changed, the change was already complete. Starter homes did not disappear in a dramatic way. They were not outlawed. They were not publicly rejected. They were simply absorbed into a system that no longer treated them as entry points. What remained were houses, but not opportunities. One of the clearest shifts was how these homes were valued. In earlier decades, a starter home was priced primarily according to what a local working family could reasonably afford. Over time, that logic reversed. Homes began to be priced according to what the market would bear, not what ordinary incomes could support. This change did not feel radical at first. Rising prices were framed as a sign of health. Equity growth was celebrated. Homeownership was increasingly described as a financial achievement rather than a life milestone. For those who already owned homes, this was reassuring. Their decisions looked wise. Their patience paid off. But for those trying to enter the system, the meaning of ownership quietly shifted. Starter homes were no longer stepping stones. They became assets competing for attention and capital from investors, landlords, and buyers with more resources. As a result, the original function of these houses changed. Small homes that once served young families were renovated, expanded, or replaced. In some cases, they were purchased not to be lived in long-term, but to be rented, flipped, or held for appreciation. The house remained. The role disappeared. This shift was reinforced by policy even when it was not intentional. Property taxes rose alongside values. Maintenance costs increased. Building codes grew more complex. Renovations became expensive. Insurance costs climbed. Each factor made modest housing less viable as a low-risk entry point. Meanwhile, fewer new starter homes were built to replace the old ones. Developers responded rationally to incentives. If building larger homes yielded higher returns, smaller homes made less sense. If zoning restricted density, modest construction became inefficient. If communities resisted change, innovation stalled. None of this required bad intentions. It required alignment. The system aligned around protecting value rather than enabling entry. This alignment reshaped expectations for adulthood. Where earlier generations moved into ownership relatively early, later generations faced longer delays. Renting stretched into middle age. Saving took longer. Family formation was postponed. Decisions once made in the 20s shifted into the 30s or beyond. This had consequences beyond housing. Starter homes once acted as anchors. They stabilized families, neighborhoods, and communities. When that anchor disappeared, uncertainty increased. People moved more often. Relationships with place weakened. Long-term planning became harder. The loss was not just economic, it was psychological. Without a reachable first step, adulthood began to feel conditional. Progress depended on factors outside individual effort, timing, inheritance, market cycles. That sense of conditionality changed how people approached life. Some delayed major decisions. Some took greater risks. Some opted out entirely. Meanwhile, the physical landscape continued to reflect the past. The streets still exist. The houses still stand. The neighborhoods remain recognizable, but the pathway that once led into them has narrowed. This is why the phrase, "they no longer exist," matters. Starter homes did not vanish as structures. They vanished as a promise. The promise that steady work could lead to stability. The promise that adulthood followed a predictable sequence. The promise that progress was gradual and shared. For many watching this, that promise was once real. It shaped choices, relationships, and expectations. Understanding how it disappeared does not require assigning blame. It requires recognizing how systems evolve, and how solutions designed for one era can become barriers in another. The story of the starter home is not unique. It reflects a broader pattern in American life. Systems built to include eventually optimizing for those already inside them. What began as an entry point became a gate, and once a gate is closed quietly, reopening it becomes far more difficult than anyone expects. The houses remain, the memory remains, but the doorway into that stage of life has changed, and that change has redefined what it means to begin. What remains? If you drive through many American suburbs today, you can still see them, the same streets, the same layouts, the same modest houses, standing quietly where they have stood for decades. On the surface, very little appears to have changed, but something fundamental has. These homes were once part of a promise that did not need to be explained. You worked, you saved, and eventually you bought a small place of your own. Not because you were exceptional, but because the system expected you to get there. That expectation shaped lives. It shaped when people married, when they had children, how long they stayed in one place, and how they thought about the future. It gave adulthood a structure that felt stable, even when life itself was not. When that structure faded, it did not announce itself. It simply stopped being available. The houses did not disappear. The neighborhoods did not vanish. But the path into them narrowed until it was no longer visible to those coming next. For many who lived through that earlier period, this change can be difficult to fully grasp. The world still looks familiar. The houses are still there. But the conditions that once made them reachable are not. This is why conversations about housing often feel disconnected across generations. People are not arguing about the same system. They are remembering different versions of it, understanding that difference does not solve the problem, but it explains the confusion. The story of the starter home is not about longing for the past. It is about recognizing how quietly systems change, and how deeply those changes shape everyday life. Some things are lost suddenly. Others fade so slowly that only memory reveals what once existed. The starter home belongs to the second kind, and whether or not it ever returns, its absence continues to define the lives built around it.